Welcome to the Frequency Labyrinth. I am Adrienne McDonald, your host. This podcast is for you if you're done with surface level self-help and ready for something deeper and actually transformative. Around here, we work with ancient wisdom, human design, gene keys, and shamanic practices, not as knowledge to collect, but as tools to live by. This isn't about one size fits all. It's about learning to work with your energy, your design, and your life. This is about integration and embodiment. We go deep here with ancient wisdom, practical integration, so that you can develop ironclad self-trust. Let's get into it. Hello, beautiful humans, and welcome back to the Frequency Labyrinth podcast. Today I'm going to be going into the partial lunar eclipse in Pisces, which is happening, my time, it's going to be 12:14 a.m. on August 28th, which I believe is Friday. And we are in the thick of eclipse season. So, and this one will be an interesting one for me. The full moon in Pisces is always interesting for me because I have a Pisces moon. So actually I'm kind of looking forward to this one because I think it's going to be a huge ahas and releases for me. So let's get into it. When I was looking at the cosmic mix for this and thinking about the themes around it, I got to thinking about there's being tired, and then there's that other kind of tired, the kind where you can take a day off or sleep late or cancel a few things and spend entire Saturday and Sunday basically doing nothing, and somehow you're still tired. And at some point you have to wonder whether the problem is actually you need more rest, because sometimes exhaustion is less about how much you're doing and more about what you keep pouring energy into. And there are things that we can work ridiculously hard at and somehow still have the energy for all the things because there's something coming out back from that exchange. And then there are things that really shouldn't require that much energy, but somehow they suck the life right out of us. And I would say this is like things that we engage in, but also people as well, right? And I think the distinction matters with this partial lunar eclipse in Pisces because we're ending August, and eclipse season is going to be ending, and this is happening in Human Design Gate 40. The sun is in 40, front and center, and Gate 40 is working with exhaustion as its shadow frequency. And I don't think this eclipse is necessarily asking us how to fix the exhaustion. I think it may be asking us to get a little bit more curious about why it's there in the first place. So, it's information in the world. You may not still know what any of this is becoming yet. And that may be one of the most important pieces of this eclipse, because we tend to assume that clarity means knowing what happens next. And sometimes clarity is simply knowing what you've been doing isn't working anymore and releasing that. And the sun during the eclipse is moving through, as I said, Human Design Gate 40, the Gate of Aloneness, and the gene keys moves from exhaustion to resolve to divine will. And Gate 40 is one of those gates where the name can send people in the wrong direction, because aloneness here isn't really about being necessarily lonely or isolated. It understands a relationship between work and rest, giving and receiving, participating and pulling back. It's part of the tribal circuitry, so there's an exchange underneath it. I contribute something to the bargain and something comes back to me. And this doesn't mean that every relationship needs to be an accounting spreadsheet, okay? Where everybody is contributing the exact 50% at all times or whatnot. Life doesn't really work that way. Sometimes one person carries more and sometimes the other person does at times, right? Sometimes you give because someone you love doesn't have anything to give back to you right now. But over time, there has to be something coming back into the system that the exchange remains viable. Otherwise, somebody eventually runs out of gas. And that's what makes the exhaustion piece so interesting to me. Like, we treat exhaustion like it's a personal management problem. You know, we need better boundaries. We need a better schedule. We need more sleep. We need to stop scrolling at midnight. We need another planner because, you know, a planner will finally be the planner that gets our lives together. I can't tell you how many freaking planners I've brought my day with this thought process. And that's because I think that our society has so much focus on quote unquote productivity, right? And, you know, sure, sometimes we really do need to go to bed, but Gate 40 is asking a different type of question. What if you're exhausted because the bargain itself doesn't work anymore? What if you're giving more energy to something than you're giving back, and you've been doing it for so long that you stop noticing. You just know that you're tired. And there are relationships where this happens. There are jobs and businesses and family roles and friendships and communities and projects, and even the things that we sometimes desperately wanted can eventually become arrangements we're maintaining mostly because we've invested so much in them. Or we don't want to be wrong, or we are not clear what, you know, taking that leap of faith will look like. So we stay with the familiarity of the situation. And I think that you know, last part matters because an expired agreement doesn't automatically mean that it was a bad agreement. You can have genuinely wanted something when you said yes to it. You could have loved the work, you could have loved the person, you could have believed in the project, and you can still have wanted to be the dependable one or the one that anyone and everyone could call, and you could have built an entire life around that decision, and it made complete sense 15 years ago, 5 years ago, last year. That doesn't mean that you signed a lifetime contract with that version of yourself. Sometimes the circumstances change. Sometimes the other person changes. Sometimes you change. Sometimes the exchange changes. And sometimes we keep honoring old agreements long after everyone involved has stopped receiving what they originally came for. And that can be really difficult to confront. It could be really difficult and challenging to have those types of conversations, but they really are necessary because when we enter into these things, you're giving your life force to them, right? You know, and across from Gate 40, the moon is moving through Gate 22, which is the Gate of Openness, when the gene key is moving from Dishonor to Graciousness to Grace. And I love Gate 22 here because the openness almost gets misunderstood as much as the aloneness does. You know, Gate 22 isn't about being endlessly available. It's emotional. There are times where the door is open and times when it is absolutely not. And forcing the door open doesn't make you more evolved. Sometimes you're available for the conversation and sometimes you're not. And sometimes you can hold space for someone and sometimes you got nothing. And I mean, as a shamanic practitioner, that is one thing that I have been increasingly aware of for myself over the past 5 years or so, is I will tell someone I don't have the space right now. I'm much better at that because I consider holding space for someone a sacred act. So I want to make sure that I can show the hell up in the right way before I agree to do that for someone, you know? And, you know, sometimes you want to participate and sometimes you need everyone to leave you alone for a minute. And Gate 22 understands that emotional openness has timing. But we've attached a lot of morality to availability. Being open is good. Being helpful is good. Being accommodating is good. Being the person that always answers the phone makes you a quote-unquote better person. Being able to handle everything makes you a better person. And then we don't want to be, when we don't want to be available, then we start wondering what's wrong with us, or we feel like we're being judged. And in some cases, you absolutely the hell are. That's their problem, not yours. Gate 22 says maybe there's nothing wrong with the door being closed sometimes. Maybe you're not in the mood. Maybe you don't have the bandwidth. Maybe grace has less to do with forcing yourself to stay open and more about being honest where you are in the moment. So when I put Gate 40 and Gate 22 together, the question underneath this eclipse is, I feel like it's, what are you forcing yourself to remain open to that is exhausting you? And I'm not talking about doing like a dramatic purge. I mean, it could be. You don't have to quit your job or dump your partner or block half your contact list because the moon is in Pisces. I'm talking about noticing where the exchange has changed. Where are you continuing to say yes because you've always said yes? Where are you continuing to be available because people expect you to be available? Where are you continuing to carry something because at some point it became your job and nobody ever stopped to ask you, hey man, is this still your job? This also brings up the difference between like devotion and depletion, which I think is important because we've gotten a little too quick to interpret difficulty as evidence that something is wrong. Things worth having can be hard sometimes. Relationships go through difficult seasons. Businesses can have ugly months. I'm here to tell you, that is so true. Creative work can be frustrating. I mean, James has been working on a book now for quite some time, and he's just like, I need to tweak it a little bit more, right? Or I wish this was going faster. Sometimes commitment means continuing when you'd really rather not. But there's usually still some sort of life underneath the devotion. You may be tired, you may be frustrated or annoyed, but somewhere underneath all of that there is a yes. Depletion feels different. Depletion is when you keep going back to the same well and there's just nothing there. You're continuing because you've always continued, because stopping would create questions that you don't know how to answer, or because you spent so much time and energy building the thing, and then admitting that you don't want to keep doing it feels almost impossible. I will also say that well sometimes, it's not just going back to the same well and there's nothing there. Sometimes you're going back to the well and you're scraping like the drops that are left in it, the crumbs, if you will. So, and you're taking that crumb and you're making the crumb a lot bigger. You're making the crumb an entire biscuit, and it's just not a biscuit anymore. So, admitting that you don't want to keep doing the thing or being in the thing sometimes can feel impossible. And that's very Pisces. Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac. It dissolves things. It gets fuzzy around the edges. It's not particularly interested in handing Virgo like the neat little answer Virgo would appreciate right now. And there's sometimes when we know something is finished before we have a clue what replaces it. And I think this eclipse may be bringing some of that right into that space right now. That you can't you don't want to keep doing what you're doing or doing it a particular way, and you don't really know what you want to do instead. An identity doesn't fit without having a new one, but you don't have a new one ready yet. You can know you're done with a particular version of your work, relationship, community, or life without having the next version waiting in the backstage. It's uncomfortable, but it's true, which brings me back to molting, because I've been beating this crab metaphor to death all month, and apparently we're going to get the last bit of mileage out of it before August is over. A crab doesn't molt because there was something wrong with the shell. The shell did exactly what it was supposed to do. It protected the crab. The problem is the crab kept growing, and eventually what used to protect starts restricting, and the shell has to come off before the new one is fully ready. And there's a period where that crab is soft and vulnerable and probably would really prefer that everyone stop asking what its 5-year plan is or 30-year plan. Besides, Uranus is in Gemini. All of our plans are just maybe to next week. And I feel like this lunar eclipse is part of that process. The Leo solar eclipse earlier in the month had the 7 wands all over it, raised questions. And, what are we still defending? What are we still fighting for? And 2 weeks later, Pisces asks us, how tired are you from defending it? Because eventually that becomes part of the information as well. And then we have Fomalhaut sitting right on this eclipse. And Fomalhaut is one of the 4 royal stars of Persia and carries this long association with vision and idealism and spiritual aspiration and the potential for tremendous success. But traditionally, as with all the royal fixed stars, there's a catch. The integrity of the vision matters. It has this theme around what happens when the ideal becomes corrupted or when we lose contact with the original version was what that was supposed to be about. And I think this gives us another layer to this eclipse that, I don't know, maybe one of the dreams you have isn't dead. Maybe you're exhausted from the structure you built around the dream. You can love the work and hate the business model you created around it. You can still care about someone and know that the relationship, the way it currently exists, does not work. You can believe deeply in a project and realize that you don't want to be the person responsible for running it anymore. You can want community and be completely over the particular community that you're currently in. Somewhere along the way, we can become so busy maintaining the machinery around something that we forget what the machinery was originally supposed to support. Then one day we look around and realize that most of our energy is going into keeping the structure alive instead of doing the thing that we actually cared about in the first place. And, with Fomalhaut, I think that the question may not be, do I still want this? It may be, if I stripped everything I built around it, is there still something here I want? Maybe the dream survived and the container didn't. Maybe you need to stop treating one particular form of the dream as the only form it can take. And I think this is where Mercury becomes really important, because early in that day it has a cazimi, and traditionally that can bring up a moment of illumination, clarity, or purification around mercurial matters like communication and thinking and information, decisions, language, the stories that we're telling ourselves. And Mercury's in Virgo, where Mercury is extremely strong. Virgo wants evidence. Virgo notices the pattern. Virgo catches the detail that we kept ignoring because it didn't fit the story we wanted to tell. And then hours later we get into this Mercury opposing the moon in Pisces. So if you have this strange experience of knowing exactly what the facts are and still have absolutely no idea what they mean for the future, you can really look at the evidence and say, okay, something's changed. This pattern keeps repeating. Clearly, this is not sustainable. And okay, what now? Well, maybe you don't know quite yet. So I think that's one of the more useful ways of working with this eclipse, because we tended to demand too much from clarity sometimes. We think if we finally understand something, we should immediately know what to do about it. And that's just not accurate. But underneath the pattern and deciding what happens next, I feel like that those are separate processes sometimes. And then, you've got Uranus and Gemini squaring the eclipse, and Uranus is not going to let this stay entirely theoretical, I don't think. It disrupts patterns and introduces the thing that we really weren't accounting for, and it does that with liberation in mind. And in Gemini, that can sometimes happen through information, conversations, ideas, news, technology, something someone says, something you read, some sudden shift in the way you're thinking about a situation. And again, sometimes Uranus doesn't give you the answer. It just makes the old answer stop making sense. And I would say pay attention to particular information that doesn't fit your existing explanation. Maybe someone says something that changes how you see a situation. Maybe you learn something you didn't know. Maybe you hear yourself telling the same story you've been telling and suddenly realize that you don't actually believe it anymore. So, and it's because sometimes the body figures out an expired agreement, if you will, before the mind does. You can pay attention to what little nudges you're getting there as well, right? I feel like one of the useful questions here is, does rest restore me enough to return to this? Or does rest simply give me enough energy to tolerate it again? Because those are not the same thing. And if I take a break and come back and I'm genuinely ready to engage again, I was probably just tired, mentally tired, spiritually tired, physically tired. If every break simply gets me functional enough to drag myself through another round of the same thing, then maybe I need to look at the arrangement itself. That's the way I approach this now. And that brings me to resolve, which is the gift frequency of 40. Resolve doesn't necessarily mean digging deeper and finding more willpower, particularly if you've got an open ego center in human design. Resolve can be what happens to you when you stop having the argument with yourself, the same argument over and over. Like, think about how much energy indecision uses. You rehearse the conversation, you imagine every possible outcome, you explain to yourself why that's not bad, it's not too bad, it's not like, especially in relationships, because we find ourselves comparing ourselves to an old relationship. And maybe you were in an old relationship that wasn't great, and your new relationship isn't great either, but you're like, well, it was better than that last one. No. Let it stand on its own, right? You have to stop playing these games where you're like, you explain to yourself why it's not that bad, then you decide you're done, then you decide that you're overreacting, and then you give it another month and another quarter, and then suddenly a whole year has passed, and you're having the exact same internal conversation. And sometimes there's a tremendous amount of energy release when the argument ends. That doesn't mean that the external situation changes immediately. You may still need to work out the logistics. You may have responsibilities. You may need time. But internally, something settles. There's a resolve. And from there, the Gene Keys moves toward divine will, which I don't interpret necessarily as some cosmic force swooping in and taking over your life. I think that there's something here about recognizing the limits of personal willpower. There are things that we cannot force into remaining alive just because we really, really wanted them to work. And Gate 22 brings grace into that same conversation. I think grace here is probably much less glamorous than, people want it to be. Grace can look like you're admitting that you changed your mind. It can look like allowing something to have been meaningful without requiring it to last forever. And it can look like disappointing someone without immediately assuming their disappointment means that you made the wrong decision. It can look like closing a door without needing to burn down the entire freaking building behind you. And it can look like you're admitting that you're not ready to decide yet. Eclipses aren't deadlines. Something can become visible around an eclipse and take months to unfold. You may realize something now that you don't want to act on until October. or November. You may look back 6 months from now and realize that that was when the internal shift happened, even though externally nothing changed for a while. So I wouldn't use this eclipse to force an answer necessarily. I would use it to pay attention. So I'm going to give you 3 things to watch for. First, watch the exhaustion that keeps coming back, not ordinary tiredness. Pay attention to the places where you rest, recover, and they become depleted almost immediately when you re-enter the situation. And ask whether you actually need more rest or you're repeatedly using rest to make an unsustainable arrangement temporarily tolerable. Gate 40 can make the energetic bargain much easier to see, particularly when you've been giving because you were the one who always had to do the giving. Second, watch for information that changes the story. With the Mercury cazimi, earlier in the day, Mercury is opposing the eclipse in Uranus and Gemini, squaring it. Conversations and information matter here. Something small may suddenly connect several dots. Somebody may say something that lands differently. You may notice a detail that you overlooked. You may finally hear what you've been saying to yourself. Don't assume the important information has to arrive with like flashing lights around it, though. Uranus can blow things open, but sometimes the disruption is simply realizing the explanation that you've been using, it just doesn't make sense anymore. And then third, watch the difference between the dream and the structure around the dream. This is the Fomalhaut piece. I feel like if you're questioning something that you've spent years building, don't automatically immediately assume that the original desire is gone. Strip away the machinery for a minute, right? Strip away the structure, strip away the business model, the role, the relationship structure, expectations, identity. Sunk cost is a big one. And everything that you've attached to it. Is there something underneath all of that still matters to you? Because maybe you're not done with the dream. Maybe you're done with this particular version of it. And that feels like where we are and where we're going to end eclipse season. We've spent August talking about the molting. And then what happens to the shell after, when you've been living inside, no longer have room to move around. The Leo solar eclipse asked you what you were still defending and why you're still defending it. And this Pisces lunar eclipse comes along 2 weeks later and asks how much of the energy that of defense has cost you, right? And maybe exhaustion isn't a request for more rest. Maybe it's like an honest accounting of an exchange that stopped working for a while ago, right? Mercury cazimi is probably going to help us see that pattern. And Gate 40 asks us to go look at the bargain and see where we're exhausted from holding up our end of something that may be no longer reciprocal, okay? And Gate 22 is asking us whether we're genuinely open or whether we've simply gotten very good at overriding the closed door, okay? And Pisces does not require us to know exactly what replaces any of it yet, okay? That's the last part of molting season. Old shell's cracked. New one isn't ready. You know what doesn't fit. You may even know why it doesn't fit. What you don't know is, what you're going to look like without it. And that's usually the part where we panic and try to climb back into something we've already outgrown. So maybe don't rush that part. Maybe pay attention to what's exhausting you. Pay attention to what you learn. Pay attention to what matters underneath all the stuff you built around it. And maybe let that be enough information right now. I hope this was helpful. If you found it helpful, please share the episode out with people. I appreciate it. And also, always remember to find beauty every day and seek the magic in the mundane. Thanks for tuning in today. As always, take what resonates, leave the rest. Let whatever landed move through you in whatever way it needs to or wants to. And also, if you want to explore more, you'll find more information in the show notes. If this episode stirred something in you, please share it out or leave a quick review. It helps so much, and I really appreciate it. And remember, this work is about integration, and it always starts with self-trust.